They say life's biggest moments can come when you least expect them. For James Wilson, that moment arrived on a cold Chicago night. Huddled outside the United Center in his worn basketball shoes, he was just another face on the streets that evening. Until Michael Jordan stopped, looked at his carefully polished shoes, and did something no one expected. He sat down next to James and bought him dinner. But it wasn't the meal that would change everything. It was the note Jordan handed him an hour later. A note that would reveal a connection spanning 40 years, 2 generations, and the very heart of basketball itself. This is the story of how a simple act of kindness revealed an extraordinary bond between the greatest basketball player of all time and a homeless coach who had never stopped believing in the game. James Wilson pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders as the Chicago wind whipped down State Street. February in Chicago was never kind, but this winter felt especially cruel. His fingerless gloves, found in a donation bin last week, did little to keep his hands warm as he clutched a cardboard sign that read, "Former coach, down on luck, any help appreciated." The sign wasn't just words. For 15 years, James had been Coach Wilson at Roosevelt High School, leading their basketball team and helping hundreds of kids find their way to college through sports scholarships. Now, at 45, he was just another face on the street, trying to survive each day as it came. "Hey, Coach!" a voice called out from the crowd of people rushing past. James looked up to see Tommy Chen, one of his former students, now wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase. "I almost didn't recognize you. Are you okay?" James forced a smile. He'd gotten good at that lately. "Just a rough patch, Tommy. How's the accounting career working out?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably, looking at his former coach sitting on the cold sidewalk. "It's good. I never would have made it to college if you hadn't pushed me to keep my grades up while playing ball." He reached for his wallet. "Coach, let me help." "I'm fine, Tommy," James said firmly, even as his stomach growled. "You keep taking care of your family. I heard from your mom that you've got twins now. Congratulations." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "Coach, please. You helped so many of us. The best help you can give me is to keep being successful," James interrupted. "That's what I always coached you kids for, to build good lives. Now get going before you're late for work." As Tommy reluctantly walked away, James closed his eyes and remembered his last day at Roosevelt High. The principal's sympathetic face as she accepted his resignation. "Take all the time you need, James," she'd said. "Your job will be here when Sarah gets better." But Sarah didn't get better. The cancer took her anyway, despite selling their house and emptying their savings for treatments. The medical bills kept coming even after she was gone. Within 6 months, James had lost everything: their small apartment, his car, and finally, too ashamed to face his students, his coaching job. The sun was setting now, and the temperature was dropping further. James gathered his few possessions: a backpack containing a change of clothes, some toiletries he used at the shelter when there was space, and his most precious possession, a photo album. He carefully wrapped it in a plastic bag to protect it from the snow that was starting to fall. Making his way through the crowds, James headed toward the United Center. The Bulls were playing tonight, and sometimes people leaving the game would be feeling generous enough to spare a few dollars. More importantly, the building's massive walls blocked some of the wind, making it one of the warmer spots to spend the night when the shelters were full. As he walked, his mind drifted to warmer days. Teaching kids the perfect form for a jump shot. Staying late to help players with their homework because you couldn't play if you didn't maintain your grades. The joy on a student's face when they received their first college acceptance letter. "Remember, it's not about the score," he used to tell his teams. "It's about who you become while playing the game." Now those words felt hollow in his empty stomach. Yet something made him keep that sign, announcing he was a coach. Maybe pride, maybe hope, or maybe because it was the one true thing he had left about himself. He found his usual spot near the United Center's west entrance. Game nights always brought a mix of emotions. The excitement in the air reminded him of his coaching days, but it also highlighted how far he'd fallen. Still, he couldn't stay away. Basketball had been his life for too long. Opening his photo album, James pulled out his favorite picture, his team from 5 years ago, holding up the state championship trophy. In the photo, he was grinning ear to ear, surrounded by jubilant teenagers who believed they could conquer the world. 23 players from that team went to college. He knew because he'd kept track of every single one of them. Even after he ended up on the streets. The crowd started growing as game time approached. James watched families hurry past, parents holding their children's hands, teenagers wearing Bulls jerseys, business people coming straight from work. Some avoided looking at him. Others gave sad smiles or hurried past. A few dropped coins or dollar bills in the cup beside him. "Thanks for coming to the game," he said to each person who donated, still playing the role of gracious host. Old habits died hard. The smell of hot dogs and popcorn from the concession stands made his stomach twist. The sandwich he'd gotten from the food pantry that morning felt like a distant memory, but he'd learned to ignore hunger. There were worse things, like the cold that seemed to seep into his bones, or the loneliness that crept in during the quiet hours of the night. As the crowd thinned and the game's opening buzzer sounded from inside, James pulled out his other treasured possession, an old pair of basketball shoes. They were worn and cracked, but he kept them polished. They were the shoes he'd worn while coaching his last game, a close loss in the state semifinals. He'd planned to retire them after winning the next year's championship. Now they were just another reminder of dreams interrupted. The shoes had Sarah's initials written on the heel. She'd done that the Christmas she gave them to him. "For my champion," she'd written on the card. James ran his finger over the faded letters, remembering her smile, the way she never missed a home game, how she'd bring hot chocolate for the whole team during cold practices. Night was falling fully now, and with it came the harder questions. Which shelter might have space? If none did, which doorway would block the most wind? Should he use his last $5 for food now or save it for tomorrow? These were his coaching decisions now. But instead of planning game strategy, he was planning survival. A cheer erupted from inside the United Center. Someone must have scored. James smiled slightly, picturing the play in his mind. Some habits never left you, even when the game did. He carefully repacked his photo album and shoes, protecting them from the growing snowfall. The crowd inside would be focused on the game for the next few hours. Maybe he could close his eyes for a bit, rest against the wall. Just for a moment. "Stay strong," he whispered to himself. Another old coaching habit. There's always another quarter to play. But as the snow continued to fall and the wind cut through his jacket, James Wilson, the coach who had helped so many kids reach their dreams, pulled his knees to his chest and wondered if he'd ever find his way back into the game of life. He didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would change everything. For now, though, he was just the man on State Street, holding on to his memories of better days as the sounds of the game he loved drifted through the walls of the United Center and into the cold Chicago night. The next morning arrived with a burst of sunshine that made the fresh snow sparkle. James blinked awake, his joints stiff from sleeping in the cold. He'd managed to find a spot behind some trash cans near the United Center's service entrance, which had kept the worst of the wind away. Checking his watch, a cheap digital model from the dollar store, he saw it was just past 7. The street cleaners wouldn't start their rounds for another hour, which meant he had time to get himself together before moving on. As he stood up, his stomach growled loudly. The hunger was harder to ignore in the morning. James counted the wrinkled bills in his pocket. $4.37. Not enough for both breakfast and lunch, but maybe enough for a coffee to warm up. "Morning, James," called out Jerry, one of the United Center's maintenance workers. Over the past few months, Jerry had gotten used to seeing James around and sometimes snuck him leftover hot dogs from the concession stands. "Big ceremony tonight. They're retiring number 23. James nodded. Everyone knew Michael Jordan's number was being officially retired. It was all over the news. The United Center would be packed, which meant better chances of getting enough money for a meal. "You should stick around," Jerry suggested, unlocking the service door. "Might be good for tips." "Thanks, Jerry. I might do that." James made his way to the public bathroom at the nearby gas station. The attendant there, Maria, was another friendly face who let him use the facilities to clean up each morning. He splashed cold water on his face and tried to make himself presentable, combing his graying hair with his fingers. Looking in the mirror, James barely recognized himself. His face was thinner now, his eyes tired, but he still tried to maintain some dignity. He straightened his jacket, tucked in his shirt, and made sure his shoes were clean. "Appearance matters," he used to tell his players before games. "It shows respect for yourself and the sport." The morning passed slowly. James walked to keep warm, occasionally stopping to help tourists with directions. Around noon, he treated himself to a small coffee from McDonald's, savoring each sip as he watched people hurry past on their lunch breaks. By late afternoon, the energy around the United Center was electric. News vans lined the streets, and fans began arriving early, many wearing vintage Jordan jerseys. James found his usual spot, setting out his cup and sign. "Coach!" a voice called out. It was Tommy again, this time with his wife and twin daughters. "I brought you something." He handed James a paper bag containing a warm sandwich and a bottle of water. "Tommy, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Tommy interrupted. "You never let us give up, Coach. Don't you give up either." He pressed a business card into James's hand. "My firm is always looking for good people. When you're ready." James tucked the card carefully into his pocket, touched by his former student's kindness. He watched Tommy's family disappear into the growing crowd, remembering when Tommy was just a nervous freshman trying out for the team. The sun was setting when the black SUVs started arriving. James recognized some former Bulls players heading into the building. The crowd was getting thicker, and his cup was slowly filling with donations. Maybe he'd have enough for a room at the cheap motel tonight, a rare luxury that would mean a real bed and a hot shower. That's when it happened. A particularly large group was making its way toward the entrance. Security guards cleared a path through the crowd. In the center of the group, wearing an impeccable suit, was Michael Jordan himself. James didn't expect Jordan to even glance his way. Celebrities passed him all the time, their eyes sliding past as if he were invisible. But something made Jordan pause. He looked at James, then at James's worn but carefully polished basketball shoes. The entire entourage stopped, creating a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Jordan stepped away from his group, moving closer to where James sat. "Those are Air Jordans," he said, pointing to James's shoes. 1995 edition. James nodded, surprised Jordan had noticed. "My wife gave them to me. Last pair I ever coached in." "You're a coach?" Jordan's voice was genuinely curious. "Was," James corrected. feeling self-conscious about his current state. Roosevelt High, 15 years. Jordan didn't immediately respond. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone. He sat down on the cold ground next to James. "Sir," one of the security guards started, "we have a schedule to keep." Jordan waved him off. "The ceremony can wait 5 minutes." He turned back to James. "Tell me about your team." Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was hunger, or maybe it was because James hadn't really talked about basketball with anyone in months. But he found himself opening up. "We weren't the biggest team or the most talented," he said, "but we worked harder than anyone else, made it to state semifinals 5 years ago." "What was your coaching philosophy?" Jordan asked, seeming genuinely interested. "Basketball is just the tool," James replied, quoting words he'd said countless times in practice. "The real game is learning not to quit, learning to push through when things get tough, learning to believe in yourself and your teammates." Something flickered in Jordan's eyes. He glanced at James's sign, then at the cup with its few dollars and coins. "When did you last eat?" Jordan asked. James thought about lying but decided against it. "Had a sandwich at lunch. Former student brought it." Jordan stood up, brushing off his expensive suit. "Come with me." "Sir," the security guard tried again. 5 more minutes, Jordan insisted. He helped James to his feet. "There's a diner around the corner. Let's get you a real meal." James felt like he was dreaming as he walked alongside Michael Jordan. People stared, took pictures, whispered. The diner's owner nearly fainted when Jordan walked in. They sat in a booth, and Jordan ordered 2 full meals. As they waited for the food, he asked James more questions about coaching, about his teams, about the games they'd won and lost. James found himself talking about Sarah, too. How she'd never missed a game. How she'd battled cancer with the same determination he'd tried to teach his players. How losing her had been like losing his foundation. The food arrived. Hot, plentiful, real food. James tried to eat slowly, to maintain dignity, but it had been so long since he'd had a proper meal. "Thank you," he said between bites. "You didn't have to do this." Jordan watched him eat with an unreadable expression. "Sometimes people just need a timeout to catch their breath," he said, using basketball terminology that made James smile. "Sometimes they need a new play to run." They talked for almost an hour. James couldn't remember the last time someone had just talked to him, treated him like a person instead of a problem to avoid. Jordan listened intently, asked questions, shared some of his own coaching experiences. Finally, one of the security guards approached again. "Mr. Jordan, we really have to go." Jordan nodded, standing up. "Wait here," he told James. "I'll be back in an hour." The ceremony. James started to protest. "Will still happen," Jordan finished. "Just wait here. Order whatever else you want. It's taken care of." He turned to the diner's owner. "Make sure he's comfortable." As Jordan headed for the door, he paused and looked back. "You know what the hardest part of coaching is?" he asked. James thought about it. "Knowing when to push and when to step back." Jordan smiled. "Knowing that sometimes the biggest victories don't show up on the scoreboard." With that cryptic comment, he was gone, leaving James in the warm diner with a full stomach and a growing sense that something extraordinary was happening. The diner's owner brought him coffee and pie, refusing to let him leave. "Mr. Jordan's orders," she said with a wink. So James waited, wondering what could be so important that Michael Jordan would promise to return on the night of his jersey retirement. He didn't know that in less than an hour, his life would change forever with a single folded note. For now, though, he savored the warmth, the food, and the simple pleasure of being treated like Coach Wilson again. If only for a little while. An hour can feel like forever when you're waiting for something. James watched the clock on the diner's wall tick slowly forward, each minute stretching out like a full quarter in a close game. The owner, Mrs. Chen, kept his coffee cup full and occasionally brought him more pie, but even her kindness couldn't calm his growing nerves. Through the window, he could see the United Center glowing in the night. The ceremony would be starting soon. Somewhere in there, Michael Jordan was having his number retired while an arena full of fans celebrated his legacy. Yet for some reason, Jordan had promised to return here, to this small diner, to give James a note. "More coffee, Coach?" Mrs. Chen asked, already pouring before he could answer. She'd started calling him Coach after overhearing his conversation with Jordan. It felt good to hear that title again. "You know," she said, sliding into the booth across from him, "my nephew played basketball at Roosevelt High about 5 years. Ego. Kevin Chen? Skinny kid? Terrible jump shot?" James's face lit up with recognition. "Kevin. He worked harder on that shot than anyone I've ever coached. Stayed late after practice every day for a whole season. And now he's teaching math at Roosevelt," Mrs. Chen said proudly. "He always said you were the one who convinced him he could do it." The memory hit James like a fresh wave of warmth. Kevin had been so frustrated, ready to quit the team and drop out of school. But James had seen something in him. Not just athletic potential, but a mind for numbers and patterns. "We used geometry to fix his shot," James remembered aloud. Talked about angles and trajectories. Once he understood the math behind it, everything clicked. His mind drifted back to that time, before Sarah got sick, when coaching wasn't just his job, but his way of changing lives. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his photo album, carefully turning to the team photo from Kevin's senior year. "There he is," James pointed. "Front row, third from the left. He made the game-winning shot in the regional finals that year." Mrs. Chen leaned in to look, her eyes misting slightly. "That's the thing about good coaches," she said softly. "They don't just teach the game, they teach life." The bell above the diner's door chimed, making James jump. But it was just a regular customer coming in from the cold. The ceremony at the United Center must still be going on. James checked his watch again. 45 minutes had passed. His fingers traced the edges of another photo in the album. It was from his last game as coach, taken just before everything fell apart. Sarah was there in the background, already looking tired from her first round of treatments, but still smiling, still believing everything would be okay. "I don't know what to expect," James admitted to Mrs. Chen. "Why would Michael Jordan take an interest in someone like me? Someone like you?" Mrs. Chen raised an eyebrow. "You mean someone who spent 15 years helping kids find their path? Someone who taught them about more than just basketball?" She shook her head. "Maybe the question is, why wouldn't he?" The door chimed again. This time, a security guard from Jordan's entourage entered, scanning the diner before speaking into his earpiece. A moment later, Michael Jordan himself walked in, still wearing his suit from the ceremony, though his tie was now loosened. Chatinade. Few customers in the diner tried to act casual, but couldn't help staring. Jordan barely seemed to notice. He walked straight to James's booth, holding a folded piece of paper. "Sorry, I'm a little late, Coach," he said, sliding into the seat across from James. Ceremonies always run longer than planned. James started to speak, but Jordan held up his hand. "Before I give you this," he said, holding up the note, "I want you to promise me something." "Okay," James said hesitantly. "Don't read it until tomorrow morning," Jordan said. "Get some rest first. Mrs. Chen here has arranged a room for you at the hotel next door. On me." He smiled at Mrs. Chen, who nodded in confirmation. "Mr. Jordan, I can't accept—" "You can," Jordan interrupted firmly. "And you will. Because sometimes, Coach, the hardest thing to do is let someone else call the play." He placed the folded note on the table between them. It looked ordinary enough, just a plain white piece of paper, folded in thirds. But something about the way Jordan handled it, the way he'd made James promise to wait, made it feel like it contained something life-changing. "Tomorrow morning," Jordan repeated, standing up. "Not before. Trust me on this. Timing matters." He reached out to shake James's hand. "Thank you for the basketball talk earlier. It reminded me of something important." With that cryptic statement, he turned and left, his security detail following close behind. James stared at the note on the table. Such a small thing, yet it felt heavy with possibility. Mrs. Chen appeared with a room key for the hotel next door. "Come on, Coach," she said kindly. "Let's get you settled in. You can come back for breakfast tomorrow." The hotel room was simple, but clean, with a real bed and a hot shower. James couldn't remember the last time he'd slept in a proper bed. He placed the note on the nightstand, trying not to stare at it. What could it say? Why make him wait until morning? The questions swirled in his mind as he got ready for bed. He thought about Sarah, about what she would say if she could see this bizarre turn of events. "Trust the process," she used to tell his players when they got impatient with his coaching methods. Coach Wilson knows what he's doing. Now Jordan was asking him to trust, to wait, to let someone else control the timing. It went against every coaching instinct he had. The need to be prepared, to know what was coming, to have a plan. As he lay in the dark, the note seemed to glow on the nightstand, tempting him. It would be so easy to just take a quick peek. Who would know? But James Wilson had spent 15 years teaching kids about integrity, about doing the right thing even when no one was watching, about keeping their word even when it was difficult. So, he turned his back to the nightstand and closed his eyes, trying to sleep. Whatever tomorrow would bring, whatever that note contained, would have to wait until morning. But sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept returning to the strange events of the day. Michael Jordan buying him dinner, Mrs. Chen knowing his former player, the mysterious note that he wasn't supposed to read until tomorrow. It felt like the universe was setting up some kind of play, and he was just waiting for the ball to be passed. The question was, would he be ready to take the shot when it came? Sleep refused to come. James lay in the hotel bed, softer than anything he'd felt in months, yet his mind wouldn't quiet down. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 11:47 p.m., its red numbers glowing next to the mysterious folded note. He got up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The United Center still glowed in the distance, though the ceremony was long over. From 15 floors up, the city looked different, more like how it used to look when he saw it from his classroom window at Roosevelt High. That thought triggered a flood of memories. James pulled his photo album from his backpack and sat in the room's comfortable chair. If he couldn't sleep, he might as well take a journey through the past. The first photo was from his rookie year as coach. He looked so young, standing nervously in front of his first team. They'd won only 4 games that season, but he'd learned more about coaching, about life, than in all his years of playing. "Coach, why do you make us run these drills when we're just gonna lose anyway?" Marcus Thompson had asked during that first year. Marcus was a talented player, but had never learned discipline. "Because," James had answered, "winning isn't just about the scoreboard. It's about becoming someone who deserves to win." Marcus had rolled his eyes then, but 3 years later, he graduated as team captain and went to college on a full scholarship. Now he was a successful business owner who still came back to Roosevelt to talk to students about perseverance. James turned the page. There was the 2008 team, the first one to make it to regionals. They weren't the most talented group, but they understood teamwork better than any squad he'd ever coached. When Danny Chen, Kevin's older brother, sprained his ankle before the big game, the whole team had adapted their playing style to protect him while he was on the court. "Why didn't you bench me, coach?" Danny had asked afterward. "We might have won if you had." Some lessons, James had told him, are worth more than a trophy. The next photo made his breath catch. Sarah was in this one, presenting the team with new warm-up jerseys she'd helped design. She'd worked extra shifts at the hospital to pay for them, refusing to let James know until they were ready. "Every team needs to look sharp," she'd said, beaming as the players tried them on. "It builds confidence." Sarah had understood coaching almost better than he did. She knew when players needed tough love and when they needed encouragement. She could spot a kid having trouble at home just by watching how they practiced. More than once, she'd invited students to their house for dinner when she sensed they weren't getting enough to eat at home. "Basketball is just the beginning," she always said. "These kids need to know someone believes in them." The clock now showed 1:23 a.m. James stood up to stretch, his eyes drawn again to the note on the nightstand. What could Michael Jordan possibly want to tell him that had to wait until morning? More memories flooded in. The time he'd caught Marcus, trying to steal from the school store and, instead of reporting him, had him run extra drills while they talked about what was really going on at home. The day he helped Kevin Chen understand that his talent for calculating shooting angles could translate into a future in mathematics. The night the whole team showed up at the hospital when Sarah started her treatments, each player carrying a single rose. He remembered the state semifinals 5 years ago. They were facing a team with 3 future Division I players, but his kids hadn't backed down. Down by 20 at halftime, they'd fought back to lose by just 3 points. "I'm sorry we let you down, coach," team captain Mike Rodriguez had said. Afterward, fighting tears. "Let me down?" James had replied, pulling the team into a huddle. "You showed more heart in that loss than most teams show in a championship win. I have never been prouder to be your coach." The next photo showed his last team. He'd had to leave mid-season when Sarah's condition worsened, but they'd kept his clipboard hanging in the locker room. Every game, they'd sent him a photo of it, usually, with notes scribbled by the players. "Miss you, coach," or "This win's for you and Mrs. Wilson." James walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. The hotel's bright lights and clean mirror showed him how much he'd aged in these past few years. His hair had more gray, his face more lines, but his eyes. Sarah always said you could read his whole heart in his eyes. "Your eyes light up when you're coaching," she'd told him once. "Like you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Back by the window, James watched late-night traffic flow through the streets below. Somewhere out there, other coaches were probably in gyms right now, running late practices, teaching the same lessons he'd tried to teach. Basketball never slept in Chicago. He thought about all the players who'd passed through his program. 217. He'd kept count. 189 had gone to college. 42 on basketball scholarships. But more importantly, all of them had learned something about themselves, about what they could achieve if they refused to give up. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, remembering all the lessons he'd taught about perseverance, while his own life had fallen apart. He'd tried to keep coaching after Sarah died, but the medical bills had been overwhelming. Missing practices for bankruptcy court meetings, had felt like letting his team down. In the end, he'd walked away rather than give them less than his best. Sometimes, he'd told his players, the bravest thing you can do is admit when you need help. Now, sitting in this hotel room that felt like a dream, with a mysterious note waiting to be read, he wondered if the universe was finally calling his own words back to him. The clock read 3:45 a.m. In a few hours, he'd be allowed to read the note. Part of him was terrified. What if it was just a polite goodbye and a small donation? But another part, the part that had always believed in the potential of every player who walked into his gym, dared to hope for something more. He reached for his worn basketball shoes, the ones Sarah had given him, and carefully polished them like he did every night. The familiar motion calmed him, and he found himself humming the Roosevelt High School fight song. Win or lose, we choose to rise. Our spirit never dies. Dawn was approaching. Soon, he'd know what the note said. Soon, he'd find out why Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player of all time, had taken an interest in a homeless former coach. But for now, in these quiet hours before morning, James Wilson sat with his memories of the game he loved and the lives he'd touched, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was his turn to get back in the game. The first rays of sunlight crept through the hotel window, painting the room in shades of gold. James hadn't slept at all, but he felt more awake than he had in months. The note sat where Jordan had placed it, still folded, still waiting. James checked his watch. 6:30 a.m. Technically, it was morning. He could read it now. His hand hovered over the paper, then pulled back. Something about this moment felt sacred, like the quiet before a championship game. He wanted to do it right. First, he took a hot shower. His first in weeks. The hotel had provided fresh toiletries, and he carefully shaved away his scraggly beard. In the mirror, he could almost see traces of Coach Wilson again. At 7:00 a.m., dressed in his cleanest clothes and feeling more human than he had in months, James finally sat down at the small desk by the window. The city was waking up outside, and he could smell coffee from the diner below. With slightly trembling fingers, he picked up the note. It was heavier than he expected, written on thick, expensive paper. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing out the creases. The handwriting was bold and confident, just like the man himself. Coach Wilson, life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. 20 years ago, I watched a game that changed how I thought about basketball. It was a high school match. Some rookie coach had this undersized team playing against the state champions. His team was losing badly, but this coach wouldn't let them give up. At halftime, down by 30 points, he gathered his team, and I overheard him say something I've never forgotten. The score doesn't define you. How you handle it does. That team came back out and played their hearts out. They still lost, but they played with more dignity and heart than any team I've ever seen. That coach taught me something about what basketball really means. Yesterday, when I saw your shoes and heard you were a coach, something clicked. I made some calls during the ceremony, talked to Tommy Chen, who works at Davis & Partners, called Kevin Chen at Roosevelt High, even reached out to Marcus Thompson. He's on my charity foundation's board now. They all told me the same story, about a coach who taught them that basketball was just the tool, but character was the goal. I know about Sarah. I know about the medical bills. I know you've been living on these streets, too proud to ask your former players for help. But here's what you don't know. That rookie coach I watched 20 years ago, the one who taught me about dignity and defeat, that was you at your first coaching job in Milwaukee before you moved to Chicago. You probably don't remember that game, but I've never forgotten it. It shaped how I thought about the game, about coaching, about leadership. So here's what's going to happen. There's a job waiting for you at the United Center Community Center. Assistant Youth Basketball Director. The position comes with an apartment above the center and health insurance. Starting salary is $45,000. This isn't charity. This is basketball. This is one player passing to another who's in a better position to score. My lawyer's card is attached. He has all the paperwork ready. The job starts whenever you're ready. Remember what you told that team 20 years ago? The score doesn't define you. How you handle it does. Well, coach, the score hasn't been in your favor lately, but how you've handled it, keeping your dignity, polishing those shoes every night, still believing in the game, that's what champions are made of. Time to get back in the game, coach. There's a whole new generation of kids who need to learn what you taught me. Michael Jordan P.S. That game film from 20 years ago? I still show it to young players. Not many people can say they taught Michael Jordan something about basketball. But you did. James read the note 3 times, his vision blurring with tears. Now he remembered that game in Milwaukee, his very first head coaching job, facing the defending state champions. Everyone had expected them to forfeit when half the team came down with flu. But he'd refused to give up, refused to let his players take the easy way out. He'd never known Michael Jordan was in the stands that day. The lawyer's business card fell from the note. James picked it up, running his fingers over the embossed lettering. This was real. This was actually happening. A knock at the door startled him. It was Mrs. Chen with a tray of breakfast. "Good morning, Coach," she said, smiling at his transformed appearance. "Ready for your next season?" James looked at her, then back at the note. "Did you know?" he asked. "About the job." She set the tray down. "Mr. Jordan called last night during the ceremony. Asked about Kevin, about you. Said he was setting something right." She poured him a cup of coffee. "Kevin's already planning to have his math students join your basketball program. Says it worked for him. It'll work for them, too." James sank into the chair, overwhelmed. After everything, the medical bills, losing Sarah, living on the streets, somehow basketball was offering him a way back. "I don't know if I can do it," he whispered. "It's been so long." Mrs. Chen put her hand on his shoulder. "Yesterday, you spent an hour telling Michael Jordan about coaching philosophy. I watched you. Your eyes lit up the same way Kevin says they used to in practice." She smiled. "You never stopped being a coach, James. You just didn't have a team." She was right. Even on the streets, he'd been coaching, helping lost tourists find their way, breaking up arguments between other homeless people, encouraging anyone who would listen to keep fighting, keep hoping. The morning sun filled the room completely, now warming his face. Through the window, he could see the United Center Community Center just a few blocks away. His new home, his new team. James carefully folded the note and placed it in his photo album, right next to the picture of Sarah. She would have loved this. She would have already been planning team dinners and shopping for new clipboards. "The score doesn't define you," he whispered, repeating the words that had somehow found their way back to him after 20 years. "How you handle it does." Mrs. Chen was heading for the door. "Breakfast is getting cold, Coach," she said, "and I hear you've got a big day ahead." James smiled, feeling the weight of the past few years starting to lift. Maybe that's what Jordan had meant about timing. Sometimes you needed to hit rock bottom to appreciate the bounce back up. He picked up his basketball shoes, the ones Sarah had given him, the ones he'd kept polished through everything. Time to put them to use again. Time to get back in the game. A new season was about to begin. 6 months had passed since that morning in the hotel room. Spring had turned to summer, and the United Center Community Center buzzed with the sound of bouncing basketballs and squeaking sneakers. James stood at the edge of the court, whistle around his neck, watching his newest group of players run drills. The transformation in his life still felt like a dream sometimes. The apartment above the center had become a real home, decorated with his old coaching awards that Tommy and other former players had saved for him. Photos of his teams lined the walls, and a special frame held Jordan's note, a daily reminder that life could surprise you with a perfect assist when you least expected it. "Coach Wilson!" called out Darnell, one of his most promising 12-year-olds. "Was that pivot foot right?" James smiled, remembering how many times he'd been asked that same question over the years. "Show me again," he said, watching as Darnell demonstrated the move. The community center program had grown quickly. Word spread that the legendary Coach Wilson was back, and kids started showing up from all over Chicago. But it wasn't just about basketball. Following his old philosophy, James had partnered with Kevin Chen to create a unique program that combined sports and academics. "Remember," he told his players during water breaks, "the game is teaching you about life. Every drill, every play, every victory and defeat, they're all preparing you for something bigger." The kids would nod, probably not fully understanding yet, but the seeds were being planted, just like they had been all those years ago. A commotion at the gym entrance caught his attention. Michael Jordan had made another surprise visit, something he'd done several times since that night 6 months ago. The kids were used to it now, though their parents still crowded around the doorway with phones raised. "Looking sharp, Coach," Jordan said, nodding at James's polished shoes, the same ones he'd worn on the streets, now given new life. "Got time to talk?" They walked to James's small office, decorated with cards and letters from former players who'd heard about his return to coaching. One wall was dedicated to Sarah, covered with photos of her at games and team events. "The program's growing," Jordan observed, settling into a chair. "But there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned that night." James sat down, noting the serious look in Jordan's eyes. "That game in Milwaukee," Jordan began, "wasn't the first time I saw you coach." James leaned forward, confused. "What do you mean?" Jordan smiled, reaching into his jacket to pull out an old, folded photograph. "Take a look at this. It's from 1979. The photo was worn and faded, showing a high school basketball game. James recognized the uniforms of his own high school team from when he was a sophomore player. "I don't understand," James said, studying the image. "Look at the bench," Jordan said quietly. "Look at the assistant coach." James squinted at the photo. There, sitting next to the head coach, was a young man in a suit that seemed too big for him. He was leaning forward, completely focused on the game. "That's my father," James whispered. "He helped coach for one season before he got sick." Jordan nodded. "I was in 9th grade, trying to find my way in the game. Your father was the first person who ever told me I could be great." James stared at him, memories flooding back. You were that skinny kid who kept showing up at our practices? Dad used to stay late to work with you. He saw something in me when nobody else did," Jordan said softly. "One day, I was ready to quit. Didn't make the varsity team, thought it meant I wasn't good enough." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Your father sat me down and said something I've never forgotten. The game will test you. It'll try to break you. Your job is to prove you're unbreakable." James's hands trembled. He remembered those words. His father had said them countless times during his battle with cancer. "Dad died that summer," James said. "I knew he helped coach some kids, but I was too caught up in my own game to pay attention." After he passed, Jordan continued, I promised myself I'd make it. Not just for me, but for him. Every time someone said I wasn't tall enough, strong enough, good enough, I heard his voice. Prove you're unbreakable. He gestured at the gym outside. When I saw you on the street that night, something about you reminded me of him. The way you talked about the game, about teaching life through basketball. Then I saw your name. Made. The connection. James wiped his eyes. Why didn't you tell me this 6 months ago? Because I wanted you to come back to coaching for the right reasons. Not because of who I am, or who your father helped me become, but because it's who you are. Jordan stood up, walking to the wall of photos. You know what I see in these pictures? I see your father's legacy. Not just through me, but through every life you've touched as a coach. Through the office window, they could see the kids still practicing, running the same drills James's father had once taught, passing on lessons that had echoed through decades. There's one more thing, Jordan said, pulling out an envelope. The community center's board met yesterday. They want to rename the youth program. He handed James the envelope. Inside was a new logo design. The James Wilson Senior Youth Basketball Academy. My father's name, James breathed. A tribute to where it all began. Jordan nodded. To the man who taught his son about coaching life through basketball, who helped a discouraged kid believe in himself, and whose legacy lives on through every player you've ever coached. James looked out at his team, seeing them with new eyes. How many of his father's lessons had he passed on without even knowing it? How many times had he echoed those same words about perseverance, about proving yourself unbreakable? Dad used to say that basketball was just the beginning, James remembered aloud, that the real game was teaching kids to believe in themselves. Exactly what you told me that night at the diner, Jordan smiled. Some plays get passed down through generations. They walked back out to the gym together. The kids immediately gathered around, but James noticed they weren't just staring at Jordan anymore. They were looking at both of them with equal admiration. Listen up, James called out, his voice strong and clear. Let me tell you about a coach I once knew. He taught me that basketball isn't just about what happens on the court. It's about what happens in here. He tapped his chest. And sometimes, the lessons you teach find their way back to you when you need them most. The kids huddled closer, even the ones who usually couldn't sit still. Jordan stood quietly to the side, letting James share the story. My father coached for only one season, James continued, but his lessons are still being taught in gyms all across this country. Because that's what coaching really is. It's passing on wisdom, passing on hope, passing on the belief that you're stronger than any challenge life throws at you. He looked at each young face in the circle. When you leave this gym, you take those lessons with you. And someday, years from now, you might find yourself passing them on to someone else who needs to hear them. Jordan stepped forward. Your coach is right. 20 years ago, he taught me something about dignity in defeat. But 40 years ago, his father taught me something even more important, that I was unbreakable. He smiled at James. Now look, around this gym. The game goes on. The lessons get passed down. The circle stays unbroken. After Jordan left, James sat in his office late into the evening, looking at the old photo of his father. He thought about all the connections that had brought him here, Sarah's love, his players' dedication, Jordan's recognition, and now, his father's legacy. The next morning, he arrived early at the gym. The new sign would be installed next week, but for now, he had work to do. A new group of kids would be arriving soon, carrying their hopes and dreams onto the court. James touched the whistle around his neck, the same one his father had once used, the one Sarah had saved for him all these years. Outside, he could hear the first basketballs bouncing. He smiled, remembering everything that had led to this moment. The game had tested him, tried to break him, but in the end, he'd proved what his father had taught all along. Some things were unbreakable, like the spirit of the game, the power of teaching, and the perfect circle of a basketball legacy passed down through generations. James Wilson adjusted his whistle and walked out to meet his team. It was time for practice to begin. Sometimes the most powerful stories remind us that hope can find us when we least expect it. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are always possible. For another inspiring story, click the video appearing on your screen right now. Until next time, remember, every game has its fourth quarter comeback.